I want to talk to you today about active thinking and why this is better than the usual way of thinking, which is passive thinking. Keep listening to learn more. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Growth Philosophy Podcast, a bite-sized weekly podcast focused on empowering you to think better and upgrade your life. So let's talk about thinking. Thinking is an essential part of life. Thinking actively has enabled us to achieve incredible things as a species. We are at the top of the food chain despite not being the strongest or fastest in the animal kingdom, and that's pretty much down to our ability to think actively. We have gone to the depths of the earth and even to the moon and other planets thanks to our ability to actively think and figure things out. In that sense, active thinking is our superpower. It enables us and has enabled us to achieve incredible, amazing, and even seemingly impossible and miraculous feats. Active thinking is good for us, to say the least. On a side note, during the talk, you will notice that I use the words active and critical thinking synonymously. I do this because they are pretty much the same thing. Active thinking involves thinking things through, which is the essence of critical thinking. Furthermore, when you think critically, you think actively and vice versa. The terminology, though, matters less than the essence of this concept and the importance of the matter at hand, which is that thinking things through is beneficial, essential, and even critical. What's really worrying is that there are now incentives for not thinking. We are actually incentivized these days to not think. Mass media creates programs that entertain people at the expense of other people's stupidity, to the point that being stupid and not really thinking actually has become profitable. If this carries on, we might face a time when intelligence would be selectively bred out, since there are opportunities and incentives for not being intelligent. Like in that movie Idiocracy, where the smartest guy in the world ends up being the smartest guy just because he was from the past. It won't be an understatement to say that our ability to think actively has gotten us this far and helped our species not just survive, but thrive. But things have changed, and not necessarily for the better. The majority of the population now treat thinking like a luxury. Most people would rather just believe what they hear on the TV or social media, for example, rather than thinking about it actively and critically in order to decide for themselves if it really makes sense or not, and then fact check if something doesn't make sense. Most people don't really want to do that. It's understandable why that's how most people treat thinking. It is easier to believe what you hear after all. That's much easier. It's much easier than actively thinking about things or doing your own research to assess the validity of what you see or hear. Thinking is hard work. There is no doubt about that. But it is also important and even essential work. After all, active thinking can be attributed to our survival as a species up to now. But what happens in the future when fewer and fewer people really think? Well, here is what I think will happen in that scenario. 1, we'll very likely face an apocalypse of sorts, where the state of the world will keep getting worse, since the chances of finding real solutions to major problems will dwindle, as people won't really think actively and critically, like in that movie I mentioned earlier. Ultimately though, we might become extinct over time, because once you subtract our brains from the equation, there won't be much that will retain our status on the top of the food chain, or our ability to deal with critical and crisis situations. It should be evident by now that there is a direct correlation between our survival as a species and our ability to think actively. There is a direct correlation. That said, I don't think those scenarios that I mentioned earlier will come to pass. They're apocalyptic scenarios, right? Worst case scenarios. So it's very unlikely, extremely unlikely that they will happen. Unlikely, but not impossible. Not impossible, since the promotion of lack of thinking can potentially lead to that end. I'm hoping for the best though, so I believe that's an extremely unlikely scenario. I have hope because I believe people are smart enough to know that active thinking is an essential part of life, and more people will wake up to this fact over time. As for now, even if you discount the sort of apocalyptic extinction level scenarios I mentioned earlier, there are still many reasons why we need to think for ourselves more, not less. Here are some benefits of active or critical thinking. 1. It can help you filter out fact from fiction. 2. It can help you make smarter decisions. 3. It can help you solve problems. You get better at thinking things through and figuring things out when you think actively. 4. Thinking actively can stop you from being duped and manipulated. 5. It can help you become happier by overriding your negative beliefs. Beliefs which are nearly always are things that don't actually make sense of facts, because that's what negative beliefs usually are. So when you actively think, you can decide for yourself what makes sense and what doesn't. And the 6th benefit is that it can even promote more peace and harmony. There is a reason why diplomacy plays such an important role in world politics, after all. Those are just some of the benefits. There are more advantages to thinking actively, but they are the main ones, and should be enough reason to convince you of the fact that active thinking is much better for you than passive thinking. It is the best way to use your mind, plain and simple. The good news is that we all have this superpower, the ability to think actively. We all have the ability to choose active thinking over passive thinking. Like the writer Christian N. Bovee said, few minds wear out, more rust out. So it's not that most people don't know how to think actively, it's rather that their ability to do so has become a bit rusty. And by practicing active thinking more, we can get rid of that rust. Yet more reason to think actively and to do it more. What's truly tragic is that we don't get taught the importance of thinking actively in schools or even in college. The first time I came across this concept was in university when I was studying law. This is an extremely important concept, something we should be taught at an early age. It doesn't work out like that, unfortunately. As I've learned over the years, a lot of the important things in life, like personal finance, investing, and in this case active thinking, aren't taught to us in schools, not even in universities. It's not a lost cause though, because even though we don't get taught about it, innately we sort of know how to do it. It's an internal programming of sorts. This is how we solve problems and find solutions, after all. But the challenge is that rarely happens and becomes a last resort type of thing. Whereas ideally, I want you to make this a normal part of your life. There are many benefits to doing so, as you learned earlier. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, describes the difference between these two types of thinking pretty well in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a really good book. You should certainly check it out. So in that book, he talks about there being two types of thinking processes. The first type of thinking involves you thinking fast and impulsively. And the second type is where you think comparatively slower because you think through your options and maybe even the consequences, alternatives, and so on. That second type of thinking is what I am talking about when I mention active thinking. The first type of thinking mentioned in his book, the fast type of thinking, is pretty much passive. You act on impulse and basically your thoughts control you. But the second type of thinking, what I call active thinking, is where you are in control of your thoughts and you have the final say, since you don't jump at whatever happens. When you actively think, you think things through and make considered decisions. Guess which type of thinking leads to better outcomes for you in general? Now, in case the answer isn't obvious, active thinking is the type of thinking that leads to better results for you, both in the short term and in the long term. That said, there is a big difference though between active or critical thinking and overthinking. There is a big difference. This is something that people often get confused over, so it is important for you to remember the distinction. One is about fixing things, while the other is about stressing over things you can't do much or anything about. Active thinking helps, while overthinking usually harms. So that's something you need to be careful about. But as long as you focus your thinking on activities like thinking things through and finding solutions, you should be fine. Here's the bottom line. Not effectively using your ability to actively think things through can make your life harder than it needs to be. If you follow most people and spend your time thinking passively, which is where you let your thoughts be dictated by whatever is happening in and around you, you'll be at the mercy of external factors. You'll be at the mercy of whatever is happening in and around you. Thinking passively can keep you stuck and leave you vulnerable to every big and little thing that happens. But when you take charge of your thoughts and start thinking actively, you can gain a lot of control over what happens in your life. In any given scenario, you basically have two choices. You can either let your thoughts control you. That's the usual choice that most people make. So that's the first choice. Or you can take charge of your thoughts. So those are generally the two options you have in any given scenario. So the first one is passive thinking, whereas the other one, the second one, where you take charge of your thoughts, is where active thinking comes to play. Passive thinking is the easier option because you don't have to think. It's easier not to think. This is why it has become the default mode of operation for most people. Very tragic. I'd say probably about 80 to 90% of people opt for this option and choose to have the thinking done for them. You know how this works. We're all guilty of doing it. Passive thinking is so common that it has become the normal way of thinking. More often than not, people just run with whatever thought crops into their heads. Active thinking, on the other hand, might feel like an odd process, since we are not used to it. And because we are not used to it, or even familiar with it, most of us don't do it, because it doesn't feel normal. Here's the thing though. Even though it might not feel normal thanks to years of propaganda and negative programming that we are exposed to, it is actually a natural state of being. It is a part of us. Active thinking is a part of us, because this is how we have survived extreme conditions for hundreds of years. This is how we have come as far as we have come and solved all the challenges that we have solved so far. Active thinking is a natural part of us, a part of our core programming, and for good reason. Because without this ability, this superpower, we might have gone extinct a long time ago. We all have this superpower. It just gets rusty over time with lack of use. But shaking off that rust can empower us to deal with whatever life throws at us. As Voltaire said, no problem can withstand the assault of sustained thinking. He was referring to active thinking there, because thinking actively is how we figure things out and find solutions to challenges. We have come a long way since our prehistoric ancestors thanks to thinking actively and figuring things out. Don't let that superpower go extinct or go to waste. Use the grey matter between your ears. It's there to help you, but it can only fulfill that purpose when you actively use it. So use it. Think actively and think things through.